Last week we ended our study of the people of faith in Hebrews chapter 11 with Joseph, whom God used to get the family of Jacob, or Israel, to Egypt because of a terrible 7-year famine. In Genesis 41 through 47, we read that at the time Egypt praised Joseph and even welcomed his family. But by the time we come to chapter 1 of Exodus, with the passing of time, Egypt forgot Joseph and feared his family. In fact, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, made slaves of the Israelites and commanded all male babies be thrown in the river and drowned. And this brings us to today's study in Hebrews 11 of those who did not fear the king of Egypt, the greatest nation of all the land, the man who had the most power of all the land. Faith led others to not fear him. And that's the kind of faith we need today. So let's look at the people we're going to examine today, especially focusing on one in particular, and that being Moses, and see how they came to the point that they had enough faith that they didn't fear man. Well, we'll begin by noticing that by faith Moses was hidden. We read in verse 23, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. Now those parents by name are Amram and Jochebed. Their names don't necessarily matter for our study today, but those are the names that we find when we go back and look at the original account. Now 2 reasons are given for them hiding Moses when he was born. First, it says he was a beautiful child. Now we don't know exactly what was involved in this, but some have speculated they may have taken his physical appearance as a sign from God of the greatness in store for him, a sign for them to do whatever was necessary to save his life. And another reason we see that Moses was hidden was because they were not afraid of the king's command. Now, we're not told what punishment would be faced for defying the king, but it definitely would not have been anything good. Their faith in God, though, was great enough to keep them from fearing the king. And this is an example of faith over fear. Those who have faith in God have no reason to fear any man. As the Hebrew writer, again going back to Hebrews, in chapter 13 and verse 5 said, "For he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you." That's a promise from God. And if we have faith in that promise, we can respond as the passage continues in verse 6, so we may boldly say, "The Lord is my helper, I will not fear. What can man do to me?" Do you have the faith of Moses' parents? We all need to. If you do, then you will not fear what any man can do to you. As we continue in the chapter, we also see more of the action of faith on the part of Moses. And that is, next we see by faith Moses refused. Verse 24 says, by faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And notice that this said that this occurred when Moses became of age. What exactly does that mean? Well, we know from Acts chapter 7 and verse 23 that he was 40 years old when he made this decision. Now we could ask, why did he wait until he was this old? Why not sooner? Why not when he was younger? Well, and we just don't know exactly why. Now, it just takes some people longer for their faith to grow to this point. And sadly, some people never do. Some people never develop the kind of faith that Moses had at any age in life. Now, as we ask the question why at this point, it could be that a certain event in his life led to this decision. We go back to Exodus chapter 2, where we read about Moses. And we see there in verse 11 that it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. Now in the next verse, verse 12, we see that what Moses saw moved him to the point of killing the Egyptian. He was no longer able to ignore what Pharaoh's people, the Egyptians, were doing to his people, the Hebrews. So we see at this point, he made the decision that it was time to no longer be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. It was time to act on behalf of the people of God. We see there he decided in let's go ahead and just put up verse 25 as well. Verse 25 states the result of his refusal was that he chose rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Now notice here choosing. There comes a time when we all have to choose which direction we're going with our lives. We have to choose whether we're going to stand up for God or live for ourselves or others. For Moses, this time was now. Now, the choice, we could narrow it down to simply a matter of choosing to suffer affliction or enjoy pleasures. And without faith, the choice may appear this simple. And many people look at the choice that way and they just simply choose, well, I'd rather be happy. I'd rather have fun than suffer any kind of affliction. But with faith, there is more to consider than just the choice on the surface. When we look at it through the eyes of faith, we see that the real choice is to suffer affliction with the people of God. Moses had been exposed to many gods in Egypt, yet he had enough faith in the one true God that he was willing to suffer with God's people. Moses is now ready to do the same. He's ready to do the same. He's ready to act on his faith in God. And then we see the other part of the choice is to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Now, there were probably a lot of worldly pleasures that came with being raised as Pharaoh's son. By faith, though, Moses could see the passing nature of those pleasures and could see that they weren't worth the momentary enjoyment that came with them. He knew he could not enjoy sin and please God, so he made his choice. And we see why he made it again in verse 26. When it says, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. You see, Moses saw more reward in suffering for Christ than he saw in all of Egypt. Very similar to how the apostles respond in Acts chapter 5. When persecuted for the cause of Christ, the apostles were rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name. They could see the joy, the privilege in being able to suffer for the cause of Christ. The same thing Moses was able to see long before. Through the eyes of faith, Moses looked to the reward. He couldn't see the reward yet, but through the eyes of faith he could, and he looked to it. Now the pleasures of Egypt were easy to see and were immediate, but they were short-lived. Suffering the reproach of Christ was like an investment that involved immediate sacrifice, but would reap lasting dividends. So we see by faith Moses was able to refuse. And as we continue to look at Moses and the example of faith that he served to us, we also see that Moses forsook. In verse 27, by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Now, as we go back to Exodus, we see in Exodus 2, in verse 15, when Pharaoh heard of this matter, what Moses had done in killing the Egyptian, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled. Moses' faith led him to leave the only home he ever knew. Now, would the king pursue him? I mean, he could have. He definitely had the resources at his disposal, but apparently Moses didn't care, because he could now see, with the eyes of faith, someone greater than the king. He feared more not obeying the king, or feared more refusing the king than he did obeying God. Or let me get that straight. He feared God more than he did the king and made the decision to leave. So as we consider this decision of Moses to forsake Egypt because he no longer feared the king, because he was able to see through the eyes of faith, we continue to see what happened next, because once Moses left Egypt, he was gone for 40 years. But he came back, and his faith continued. And the next thing we read here in Hebrews 11 is that Moses kept. And this is after he came back from Egypt. Came back to Egypt, where you read in verse 28, by faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. So we go back to Exodus in chapter 5 is where we see that Moses returned to Egypt after 40 years. After God demonstrated his power through the plagues in chapters 7 through 11, in chapter 12, he told Moses about the Passover. And he gave Moses very specific instructions. In verse 7, he said, "And they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts, and on the lintel, and on the houses where they eat it." In verse 13, "Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." So in the following verses, Moses told the elders of Israel exactly what God had told him. And then in verse 28 says, "And the children of Israel went away and did so just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did." God then did as he said he would do and passed over them. We see the faith of Moses. When he returned, having the faith not to even fear the king and returning to Egypt, and then having the faith to endure with God's people as he did, and ultimately to give them the Passover, the time that they would remember long after they left Egypt. God fulfilled his promise to Moses in sparing the Israelites when he punished the Egyptians. And may we all have the faith of Moses as we examine the men and women of the people of faith in Hebrews chapter 11.